What's going on, everybody? Anthony Servino here with the Face Off Sports Network with my top fantasy football waiver wire targets for NFL Week 12. We're going to start with Christian Watson, depending on where you play, under 49% rostered. And last week, he had a season best 19 PPR points, caught all four of his targets for 150 yards. A little bit of context here. He only had 4 targets, but that led the team when it comes to target share. Jordan Love did not throw a ton of passes. I believe he only threw around 17 against the Bears in that win. And Chicago, number one defense when it comes to stifling enemy wide receivers. Now, Watson has been a disappointment this year, but if there is a time for this guy to pop, it is down the stretch for a fantasy football playoff run. Now, we know Watson, he has it in him to go on these runs when he is healthy. He's a big play waiting to happen. The next 2 games are a little bit rough. San Francisco and Miami, 10th and 5th against wide receivers, but we know he just popped against Chicago. Moreover, from weeks 14 to 17, the matchup calendar is outstanding. Detroit 29th, Seattle 21st, New Orleans 26th. Fantasy Football Championship, and what's probably going to be a meaningful game for the actual NFL playoffs against the Minnesota Vikings, 30th against wide receivers. This could be the 2024 coming out party stretch run for Christian Watson. Get ahead of the market. If he's available, pick him up now. Next up, we're going to go to Roschon Johnson. Roschon Johnson, if you need a running back, now with the offensive coordinator change, he could have some standalone value in addition to being DeAndre Swift's handcuff. Now, if we go back to when he did have a little bit of standalone value this season from weeks 3 to 5, he was getting roughly at least 7 targets and at least 7 touches in each of those games, 2 of which he had over 10 touches. He also scored 3 touchdowns in a 2-game time period and has gone for at least 8.6 in all 3 of those games, with another 10-point PPR showing and a 14.5 PPR point showing. That Bears offense was playing pretty well when Roschon was involved as a change of pace back and a chain mover and also a short yardage back to complement DeAndre Swift. Well, what did we get in Week 11 against Green Bay? The offensive coordinator change. We get 11 touches from Roschon Johnson, 33 yards on the ground, another 8 yards a receiver, punches in a touchdown. In fact, he had 4 red zone rushes, including 2 inside the 5. If we go back to earlier in the season where I just referenced, where he scored the 3 touchdowns total, weeks 4 and 5, he totaled 5 red zone rushes, including 3 inside the 5. If he's a short yardage back on the goal line, which they are showing he might be in that role again, he's going to have standalone value. We're picking up Roschon Johnson. Some tough matchups. You get Minnesota and Detroit in weeks 12 and 13. Then you get them again in weeks 15 and 16. But again, the short yardage back, he's going to have goal line opportunities. You also get San Francisco, which is 20th against the run in the fantasy championship. Seattle, they're 16th. Not a ton of great matchups ahead, but if you're in a bind, bye weeks, injuries, Roschon Johnson is a pretty good add at running back. Another running back to add, Cam Akers, only rostered in 20% of leagues, depending on where you play. But since rejoining the Minnesota Vikings, he is starting to get some action. Now, last week, Cam Akers, 37 snaps, his highest since being back. But since being back in Minnesota, 23, 29, and the aforementioned 37 snaps. Meanwhile, Ty Chandler has not been playing much at all. Cam Akers has taken over the RB2 duties, and he's also getting some touches. He's had at least 8 touches in all 3 games since being back. In week 10 against the Jags, 14 total, and last week against Tennessee, 12 total. Last week, 11.6 PPR points. He does find the end zone on a reception. But here's why we're picking him up. He's not going to have a lot of standalone value. And if you use him last week, you got lucky. Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones, he's been outstanding this year. He is still an aging running back. And although aging running backs are doing well this season, Jones has gone for under 12.2 PPR points in 4 straight games. Maybe a little bit of wear and tear. His body's breaking down. Cam Akers' usage and snaps are going up. The Vikings are thinking playoffs. Maybe they want to preserve Aaron Jones, which means more run for Cam Akers. Next up, Taysom Hill, the fantasy football week winner. Taysom Hill last week absolutely goes ballistic. We know what he did. 45.7 PPR points, 8 for 50 as a receiver, 7 for 38 for 138 and 3 as a runner. This is vintage Taysom Hill. There is not a lot of bodies on the New Orleans Saints when it comes to playmakers. There's only a few, and Taysom Hill is one of them. In fact, with Alvin Kamara on a little bit of a touchdown drought, we know Hill is getting a lot of those short yardage opportunities. So the Saints are on their bye this week. This is the best time to get Taysom Hill. Why? Because other fantasy football managers, they're not thinking about, well, I can't use him this week anyway. Be the proactive fantasy football manager. Be the smart fantasy football manager. Get him now and stash him, because next week your whole league is going to want Taysom Hill if he's available. Next week, he's going to be more expensive when it comes to FAAB or waiver priority. This week, there's a good chance, depending on your league mates, he might be free, and he's only rostered in roughly 50% of leagues, some more, some less. But the fact that he's even out there, and we know Taysom Hill, he's a little bit erratic. Since week 4, he's given us 14-6, 16-7, 45. He's hard to trust, but the schedule's not bad. There's a need for playmakers in New Orleans right now. He might be a plug and play at tight end and take what you can get for him, because there's not many guys in the NFL who can do it all and has a similar skill set to Taysom Hill. Next up, another running back, Ameer Abdullah. And Ameer Abdullah rostered in 7% of leagues. There's a reason why. He doesn't get a lot of action, so we think. Now, Ameer Abdullah in the past 2 games, 30 snaps, 49 snaps, and then last week, 35 snaps. The past 2 games in particular, when he had 49 in week 9 going into the bye, he outsnapped Alexander Mattison by 10. Last week, in week 11, coming off the bye, he outsnapped Alexander Mattison 35-29. It looks like Ameer Abdullah might be the guy in this backfield. And Mattison has been okay this year, especially from a fantasy perspective. Zamir White, it is important to note that Zamir White did play 34 snaps, and he also outsnapped Alexander Mattison. But still, Ameer Abdullah might be the guy you want. We also have to note that both Alexander Mattison and Zamir White are dealing with respective injuries. If they miss time, Ameer Abdullah is going to be the RB1 on this team. And even if they don't miss time, maybe one does. We know Ameer Abdullah is going to get a handful of touches. Again, I don't love what he brings to the table in fantasy, because he doesn't bring a lot. He's mostly a receiver out of the backfield. Sometimes you can get a high PPR floor. But I'm only picking him up if one of these other guys are out. And if both are out, I think he's a must-add, because you can use him. You can start him because he should get volume. They also have Dylan Lobby, but this is a speculative ad. Don't go crazy. Don't drop FAAB on him. But pick up Ameer Abdullah and be proactive. Next up, a wide receiver, Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. He's not rostered a ton. But this guy has been on a little bit of a run. Since week 6, he scored a touchdown in every game but one, which was week 10. He's had at least 4 targets in every game since week 7 but one, which was week 10 against the Chargers, a really tough matchup. In 2 out of his past 3 games, taking out that Chargers game, he's had 6 targets. In 3 of his past 4 games, he's had double-digit PPR points. In fact, in weeks 9 and 11, minus that Chargers game, he's had 16 and a season high last week, 19 PPR points. You're not going to get a lot of usage. There's not a lot of volume. There's still Calvin Ridley on this offense. They're still going to run the ball with Pollard. But it seems like since Will Levis has been back, Brian Callahan is letting it rip a little bit more with Will Levis, and he's a gunslinger. That's what he should be doing. And that favors the wide receiver position. Now, if Treylon Burks comes back, I don't think he will, then I think we downgrade Westbrook-Ikhine. But as long as Westbrook-Ikhine is a starter in 2 wide sits, I think you can add him and stash him. And the Titans have one of the best rest of season schedules for wide receivers. Houston, Washington, Jacksonville, Cincy, Indy, Jacksonville in the fantasy playoffs. Just seeing Jacksonville on there twice is huge. We are picking up Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, next Elijah Moore, and this is a very crowded pass-catching core where anybody can go off at any time for the Cleveland Browns. And while we all, including myself, expected Tillman to be the guy this past week, instead it was Jerry Jeudy going off. And also, Elijah Moore goes for 18.6 PPR points, hauls in 8 targets, 6 for 56. Hauls in 6 of 8 targets for 66 yards and a touchdown. He's had at least 8 targets in 3 straight games, one of which he's gone for 12. There's a lot of volume when Jameis Winston is under center. Since Winston has taken over for Deshaun Watson, he's thrown the ball over 40 times a game, which means there's ample targets to go around despite having a lot of mouths to feed, including David Njoku. I don't love the schedule down the stretch. It is a gauntlet of tough matchups, including Pittsburgh twice, Denver, Miami, Kansas City. But when you're getting that much volume, when you're going to see 8 targets a game, which is his floor in the past 3 with Winston, then you got to pick this guy up, and you can even use him in your fantasy lineups if you're in a bind. Next up, one of my favorite, if not my favorite tight end to pick up, Will Dissly down the stretch. I think if you need a tight end, he could potentially help you win a league. Will Dissly, since week 6, is averaging just over 6 targets a game, just over 10 PPR points a game. He's also led his own team in targets 3 times during that stretch. He's being targeted on 34.5% of his routes, which is 99th percentile amongst qualifying tight end. He's also getting 18% of team targets, 92nd percentile. He's also averaging 2.53 yards per route run, which is 98th percentile, and 5.9 yards after the catch. He's a really good tight end. We just forget because he had that little bit of run in Seattle. He was scoring touchdowns almost on a week-to-week basis. Then he suffered a few injuries. He is now reemerging with the Chargers. And by the way, Justin Herbert, he looks like he's playing some of the best quarterback of his career. They're also increasing the throwing volume on this offense, and Will Dissly is a big part of it. Back-to-back games, at least 6 targets, caught a touchdown last week, season best 18 PPR points, 4 for 80 as a receiver, and the aforementioned touchdown. And talk about a rest of season schedule, which is outstanding. Baltimore 23rd against tight ends, Atlanta 22nd, KC 29th, Tampa 28th, Denver 15th, New England 13th in the fantasy championship. We're picking up Will Dissly, and I think we can use him at least in the next from weeks 12 to 15 with some confidence. Let's start closing this out. MVS, I'm going to include him here despite the fact he's on a bye. And I told you guys to pick him up last week. I even told some people to start him this week. MVS is going to fill the Rashid Shaheed role. He is a downgrade of talent from Rashid Shaheed, but he fits that role well. He's a big play guy. He's not going to get a lot of volume. Total of 7 targets in the past 2 games, but guess what? He has gone for just under 200 yards on 5 receptions and 3 touchdowns. That's what we're going to get out of MVS. Bye weeks, injuries, if you need a flex option, if you're in a deeper league, there's not a lot of mouths to feed. We talked about Taysom Hill earlier. It's like really Taysom Hill, MVS, Kamara, and if Chris Olave comes back, maybe Juwan Johnson. I would treat MVS the same way I'm treating Taysom Hill. Get ahead of the market. Pick him up now on the bye week. You don't want to risk a league mate trying to get him because coming out of the bye in week 13 is a very usable matchup against the Rams, a secondary you can beat deep. Pick up MVS and stash him. The final player we are talking about today Anthony Richardson, he took the starting job back, and he actually played his best football of the year. While he did go for 30 fantasy points in week 1, he also went for 32 this week. But the difference is he did not throw an interception this week. He completed 66% of his passes compared to 47 in week 1. In fact, 66, his second highest completion percentage of the season, his highest week 4 against Pittsburgh, where he got hurt. He only threw the ball 4 times. So this was his most efficient game as a thrower against a pretty tough Jets defense. Despite the team reeling, their defense, especially defending quarterbacks and wide receivers, is still pretty good. And we finally saw the rushing get going with Richardson, 10 for 32 and 2 touchdowns. This is the guy that we bought into in the preseason. I don't know what happened. I don't know if benching him turned it on. I don't know if Steichen is game planning around his skill set better. But if this is the type of quarterback and quarterback play we're going to get out of Anthony Richardson in a tough matchup, maybe there is some hope for a rest of season run. There's not many quarterbacks on waivers right now that can give you the type of ceiling that Anthony Richardson gives you. There's some tough matchups ahead, but we know this type of skill set with the high rushing floor is really hard to defend if he's in the zone. We're picking up Anthony Richardson. You might have lost Daniel Jones. There's a lot of quarterbacks we can't trust right now. Kirk Cousins is going in the wrong direction. Aaron Rodgers is hard to trust. If you need somebody who could potentially be a plug-and-play quarterback for the rest of the year, it is Anthony Richardson.